There are many different interpretations of Chinese strategic thought that are debated in the academic literature, and the best way to approach it is by looking at the hypotheses of the individual authors and then to contrast the different debates and the different perspectives and the different approaches to understanding and predicting how China will behave under certain circumstances. Andrew Scoble, in his book, China's Use of Military Force, 2003, elaborates China's cult of the defense. Offensive action by Chinese leaders is a primary alternative for national goals and is typically rationalized as being defensive and last resort. Chinese strategic culture has changed little as compared with, say, Germany and Japan, which as modern states have promulgated new strategic thoughts. So Scoble's argument is that even though China sees itself as being defensive and moral, it couches its operations in defensive terms, but its operations can be quite aggressive. Now, this is in sharp contrast to the conventional wisdom of what's called the Fairbanks hypothesis. This is the argument that Beijing sought to avoid war during the Cold War and was cautious and therefore engaged in deterrent signaling. And once war broke out, China sought to keep the war limited in duration and scope. And so Fairbanks has characterized China's conflicts in Korea in 1950, against India in 1962, against the Soviet Union in 1969, against Vietnam in 1974-75, and again in 1979, as essentially, and other conflicts as well, as essentially very limited in scope. And Scoble challenges the Fairbanks hypothesis. China's declarations address three separate audiences. First, the domestic elites, which are focused on realpolitik. So if you're a diplomat, China discusses power in terms of offensive use, but this is within a closed community. Number two, foreign elites. And China typically presents its motivations within the context of Confucian pacifism. And finally, domestic mass population, which can be Confucian, but is also ultra-nationalistic, appealing to events of humiliation from the shame of centuries, in the 19th century. So Scoble articulates a hypothesis that the Confucian-Mencian and Realpolitik justifications are consistent and active in Chinese moral foreign policy. And this he draws from Chinese culture. Chinese culture is based on lineal feuds between clans that go back to Chinese prehistory. There was always a rejection of violence from below. So essentially you had a structure justified against rebellion. But violence could always be justified for the purposes of unification. Now, there are other theories. I mean, China could be articulated as a hydraulic society, which we looked at under Wittfogel in the previous lecture, organized to manage collective and centralized irrigation, sluice gates, dams, and canals, whose form is a type of oriental despotism where the focus is on a fear of disorder and a pursuit of social discipline. So China's legal system was both Confucian, rehabilitative, and legalistic, which is punitive. For communist China, the internal-external situation was one of continuous warfare. However, in folk culture, as opposed to elite culture in China, informs the soldier of the glory of war and the exploits of warriors, and transmits the stories through plays and songs and other stories. A famous novel, which is historically based, is the San Guo, or the story of the Three Kingdoms, which looks at various famous characters, including Xisha. And it contrasts with Western literature, because in reading the historical novel, you see that there is no simple principle of good versus evil, which is very typical of Western historical accounts, but rather focuses on individual characteristics like loyalty and guile, which guide Chinese popular folk visions of the use of violence. You can think about that in every single culture. Certainly in Islam, there is a tradition of justice and of the ummah having a great many restraints on what they can and cannot do in war, an Islamic just war theory. But on the other hand, you have the Sipahi, who are a Turkish Muslim cavalry, light cavalry that would attack with the goal of pillage, and this was justified as a military jihad against the unbelievers. And again, with the Christian tradition, you have vigilantism and crusader warriors, which contrast with the pacifistic teachings of Jesus. So just about every culture has a glorification at the youth level of violence, coexisting with a pacifistic order or version of how violence is to be viewed within society. The Communist Party of China, according to Scobell, preferred the use of force because of their historical success using force, both in winning the Chinese Civil War and in consolidating China against its neighbors. So for Scobell, the Chinese self-perception is of the core elements of the following military tradition. Number one, China is peace-loving. Number two, China is not aggressive or expansionist. And three, China uses force in self-defense. So this is the ideology that China repeats itself to its population. The guiding principles, according to Scobell, are one, reverence for unification, and two, a high threat perception of external powers. The core elements, however, are opposed by four principles. One, just war theory. The idea that the oppressed, which is traditionally China, has a right to fight against its oppressors. Second, active defense. Rather than wait to be attacked, China can attack first in order to control the situation. Number three, an intense fear of chaos that could break apart China. And number four, the welfare of the community over the rights of the individual in order to achieve the first three principles. Now, there are elite beliefs. One, peace is precious, and this is based on the unity between man and nature. Two, never seek hegemony, meaning never rule by force. There must be a moral basis for governance. Number three, if a country does not attack China, China will not attack them back first. An example of this is China's no first use pledge on nuclear weapons. If China is not attacked first with nuclear weapons, they will not use nuclear weapons in response. China's fought 3,700 wars, both against its neighbors and in civil conflicts in the last 4,000 years. Most of these have been justified as wars to unify China. So the elite beliefs result in two guiding principles for general security of China. First, the primacy of national unification, and two, heightened threat perceptions, especially ongoing fights against corruption. China is especially fearful of joint domestic and foreign threats combined, which is what it saw in the June 4th incident of 1989 that turned into the Tiananmen Square massacre of demonstrators by the Chinese army. China sees foreign threats as being severe if they occur in conjunction with domestic weakness or domestic division of China, and they also see foreign threats leveraging divisions within China to make China weak. So China's not only fearful of geographic division, but also a fragmentation of domestic cohesion caused by dehomogenization of China because of foreign ideological influence. Now, Thomas Christensen, in The Windows in War, which is a chapter in New Directions in the Study of China's Foreign Policy in 2006, argued that Chinese Communist Party leaders use force against states with superior force to, one, affect long-term political trends, two, not to solve strategic issues permanently, but to have a short-term effect. 3, trend analysis makes the Chinese Communist Party leadership fearful of closing windows of opportunity or opening windows of vulnerability that are not reversible. So there's a short time in which to act. 4, China believes it must use force to limit an adversary's level of aggression by inflicting costs. So not using force can also be hazardous. 5, China prefers to act before more favorable conditions permit an opponent to act, so it's sensitive to closing windows of opportunity of other states. 6, China focuses on the relative balance of military power and alliances. And 7, China will act even if it is the weaker state, if it's able to impose its will. Now, the theory is that the prevailing literature has argued that preventative wars are rare, particularly before the U.S. 2003 invasion of Iraq. It's a conventional wisdom. Democracies in particular don't engage in preventative war. Now, the problem with the theory is it's been only tested on near-peer competitors. Therefore, according to Christensen, China can move against Taiwan even against U.S. superiority. So let's take a look at some cases. Case 1, Korea 1950. Here you can see the North Korean attack on South Korea, and then the Pusan perimeter in the south. And U.S. General MacArthur leading UN forces landed at Incheon, which you can see is the port on the west coast of Korea. They advanced to Seoul, essentially catching the North Korean army in the rear. The UN then advanced north to the Yalu River, which forms the frontier between North Korea and Communist China. And the Chinese, once they got permission from Moscow, preempted the arrival of the UN and then pushed the UN forces back down near the 38th parallel. So Mao feared that U.S. forces in North Korea would tie down large Chinese military forces that would be therefore unavailable to deal with other external and domestic threats, including resolving the conflict against the Kuomintang government that fled to Taiwan. Fear that the U.S. would then attack China at an opportune time for the U.S. was influenced by the Western and Japanese intervention in Beijing in 1901 in response to the Boxer Rebellion. Now, there's a miscalculation. Mao is surprised by the scale of the U.S. intervention in Korea and in support of Taiwan in 1954 and 1958. Case 2, Taiwan in 1954 and 1955. Mao's attack on Taiwan's outer islands in 1954 was to counter the joining of the U.S. and Taiwan and to stop Taiwan harassment and blockades against China, because at the time the Taiwanese actually had some islands near Shanghai, a major Chinese port. Those were later conquered. Beijing was also trying to stop the creation of SATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization that would have had Taiwan as a member, to delegitimize any geographic partition so that Taiwan would never become established as an independent state, and to energize its own domestic population for the first 5-year economic plan, which had both a rural and an industrial component, for the 1953-1957 economic period. You can see in the picture here Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Kai-shek, his wife, one of the 3 Sung sisters. Mao wanted to justify the costs of engaging in the Chinese Civil War to the Chinese population, which he couldn't achieve if Taiwan remained unconquered. Now again, in 1954-55 confrontation, the U.S. came in with its navy resupplying the Taiwanese who were deployed in Quemoy and Matsu, which are the islands that you can see just off the coast of China, including the major Chinese port of Xiamen, and the islands are there to this day in 2022, although they're extremely vulnerable to a Chinese attack. Again, Mao Zedong, the Chinese leader, miscalculated. He pushed the U.S. and Taiwan together into an alliance, specifically the Mutual Defense Treaty. The third case is China's confrontation with Taiwan in 1958. Now, China was reacting to the nuclear-capable Matador nuclear weapons rocket deployment in 1957 by the U.S. in Taiwan, also to motivate a spirit of sacrifice as a part of the Great Leap Forward to make China self-sufficient, which is basically a major program to extract agricultural resources out of China to be traded to the Soviet Union in exchange for Russian industrial machines. This was a success. It led to a great increase in China's industrialization, but at a tremendous cost. 20 to 30 million Chinese peasants starved because of ill-conceived, centrally controlled Chinese agricultural policies. So it resulted in a Chinese confrontation with Taiwan. It consisted of artillery bombardments of the islands of Quemoy and Matsu off of the Chinese coast, and Chinese air attacks against the Taiwanese Air Force. The U.S. Navy intervened to help the Taiwanese resupply their islands, and Taiwanese aircraft fought and defeated the Chinese Air Force. China again was reacting to its relative weakness because it didn't have nuclear weapons like the U.S., and therefore there were strict limitations on the amount of force it could assert to recapture Taiwan, which, as long as Taiwan existed as an independent state, was a threat to the political legitimacy of the communist regime in Beijing. The fourth case is the Sino-Indian Border War of 1962. The red areas are the three avenues of attack conducted by China in October and November of 1962, which occurred at the same time as the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is why this conflict is not frequently heard of in Western media, because most newspapers were focused on the confrontation between the US and the USSR over the missiles in Cuba. So you can see the blue areas, which indicate the frontiers and the areas in dispute. There were two separate attacks in two separate waves in October and November, and China held on to the Xisha Islands, which is the red area indicated in the center, and the two areas on the extreme right were ultimately returned because China didn't have the infrastructure to deal with penetrating through the mountains once the snowfall blocked all of the valleys. Here you can see the Indian and Chinese troops that were fighting in 1962. Ultimately, there was a miscalculation. It triggered a major military buildup by India and a focus in India from domestic development with diplomatic deference to China to hostility against China, and the eventual development of China's nuclear weapons program, primarily aimed at China and Pakistan. Here is the early relationship, the Panchsheel Agreement between China and India that was signed in 1955. You can see on the left Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, and Mohandas Gandhi, who was the spiritual leader for the independence of India. And you can see Mao Zedong on the right. And India had misinterpreted the importance to China of the Xisha Islands, which for India was a remnant of the British Empire, which the British had taken from Tibet. But for China, it was a part of the Tibetan plateau that contained the main highway between China, Kashgar, that led to Lhasa, which is the capital of Tibet. And China at the time was subject to a Tibetan insurgency movement that was being partially funded by India without the full knowledge of the Indian government. Case 5 was China's involvement in Vietnam between 1964 and 1969. The U.S. goal in Vietnam was to keep communism from North Vietnam spreading to South Vietnam and for the unification of the state. China deployed 320,000 soldiers with a peak of 170,000 in 1967 and 1968, including 100 soldiers in various reconnaissance and intelligence positions in South Vietnam. China was a transit point and a supplier for 20 billion in supplies from the Soviet Union to North Vietnam, of which 90% was given as outright grants between 1950 to 1978. Some of it to the Viet Minh resisting the French, and the rest as gifts to the North Vietnamese communist regime that was resisting the U.S. presence in South Vietnam. China outfitted 2 million Vietnamese troops, built hundreds of kilometers of railroads, 3,000 kilometers of an oil pipeline, and suffered thousands of casualties operating the air defense system when the Americans were bombing North Vietnam with their tactical and strategic air power. This depicts the frontier in the Russian Far East, what was then the Soviet Far East, and you can see the city of Khabarovsk in the larger map on the right side along the Ussuri River, and you can see the blow-up of that map on the bottom left, and you can see the Xisha Island, which is in the Ussuri River, on the edge of the frontier at Khabarovsk. There, 1969, during China's Cultural Revolution, a Chinese military unit ambushed Soviet border patrols, resulting in the escalation in 1969 of the Sino-Soviet Border War, which killed several thousand. Now, there were disputes that led up to this prior to 1969, but this was seen as typical of China's aggressive attempt to enforce its territorial claims to assure that there was no exploitation of its strategic goals. This is a typical encounter between Chinese and Soviet border troops. The result was that the Soviet Union built up forces along the Chinese border, which had occurred since 1965. The Soviet goal was to protect its frontier. The Chinese goal was to demonstrate resolve and to create domestic unity as a part of a diversionary war during the Cultural Revolution. Mao had lost popularity because of the large numbers of deaths that occurred during the Great Leap Forward, and his re-entry into politics required him to weaken his ideological and political allies, and he did this by mobilizing the vast youth of China. There were more youth than there were adults, and it put China into a fair bit of political chaos, and it led to some aggressive foreign policy. Mao miscalculated. He had not anticipated the scale and the speed of the Soviet response, and ultimately China sought to de-escalate because Russian military power, coupled with tens of thousands of tactical nuclear weapons, meant that they would probably prevail if the war had escalated. Case 7 is the Xisha Islands. In 1974, the Chinese Navy attacked what are called the Paracel Islands in Western parlance, or the Xisha Islands in Chinese terminology. South Vietnam was still a U.S. ally, but the U.S. had evacuated South Vietnam as a part of a peace agreement with North Vietnam, and it was basically 12 months before the North Vietnamese unified South Vietnam by entering into Saigon, the capital. Case 8 is the Chinese attack on Vietnam in 1979. Once Vietnam was unified, Communist Vietnam essentially pursued traditional Vietnamese policy of maintaining independence against China, because China had twice occupied Vietnam at one point for several centuries. So Vietnam aligned closely with the Soviet Union, acquiring their weapons, and continued to expand its influence in Southeast Asia, including into Laos, where the Pathet Lao were allies of the Vietnamese, but also into Cambodia, which was a Chinese ally. So China, to punish Vietnam in 1979, invaded to impose costs on the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia. It was an abject failure. China's military had not fought for a very long time. Vietnam had just defeated both the French and the U.S. So Vietnam, even though it was wildly outnumbered, performed much better than the Chinese invaders. And the Chinese did not even use air power for fear that Vietnam's air force would be used against targets in China. So ultimately, China was unable to reverse the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia, and China withdrew militarily and agreed to a ceasefire. So what are the implications of China's post-World War II experience of coercive diplomacy for the final case of Taiwan? Christensen concludes that China will attack, even if it's the weaker party, to forestall a negative power relationship that could emerge and become worse in the future, and to deal with negative alliance trends. For example, if there's the emergence of an international coalition to protect Taiwan against a Chinese attack. China is worried by U.S. naval missile defense and naval protection of Taiwan, and that's obviously a major concern. China sees, however, in the long term, Taiwan's economy gradually weakening and being incorporated into China's economy. It sees Taiwan eventually becoming politically dependent. Almost 1 million Taiwanese since 1990 have moved back to Shanghai and other major cities in China, including in particular Suzhou. That's about 5% of Taiwan's entire population. Overwhelmingly, these are original Kuomintang Chinese who escaped to Taiwan during the Civil War. Now, the U.S. is formally against the Taiwanese declaring independence, and the U.S. is trying not to behave in a provocative fashion. But as we'll see in a later lecture, Taiwanese politics is divided between the blues and the greens, and the Green Party is not primarily representing the Kuomintang, but representing those indigenous Taiwanese that were there before the Kuomintang took over the regime. And their sentiment is far more for independence. And so this is a difficult issue for both China and the U.S. Now, Alistair Ian Johnson, in Chinese Foreign Policy and Transition, 2004, looked at the conventional wisdom, the interdependence literature, which argued that China's commercial engagement and involvement with international organizations and commerce would constrain China's tendency to use violence, especially since Beijing's elite depends for their legitimacy on delivering economic growth. Now, China's not engaged in any genocidal campaigns. It prefers instead non-violent assimilation. China exposes itself to high security risks in its crisis management. Looking at the Correlates of War program, which is an international relations research agenda out of the University of Michigan, which codifies disputes between states termed MIDs, or militarized interstate disputes, it identifies Communist China of having engaged in 118 militarized interstate disputes since the establishment of communism in Beijing in 1949. Now, of these 118 militarized interstate disputes, we can look at some aspects. First, there's dispute frequency. China has about 2.74 disputes per year. It's the second most dispute-prone state after the U.S. since 1949. It's the second most dispute-prone state after the USSR for the history of most of the great powers. India catches up to China in the 1980s. The two most dispute-prone periods are 1954 to 1958 and 1964 to 1968. The Deng Xiaoping period was not less war-prone than the Mao Zedong period that extended until 1976. So even though China became significantly more pro-Western and anti-Soviet in the late 70s and early 80s, it still had the same number of disputes with countries on its frontier. Now, it should be pointed out the 1964 to 68 period was concurrent with the Cultural Revolution in China. Now, of the dispute types, 49% are territorial. 41% of the territorial militarized interstate disputes occurred in the period of 1949 to 1959, which is what's expected. It's consistent with the hypothesis that young states are aggressive in establishing their territory on independence. Dispute force levels are generally the constant average hostility, but it's much higher than the average of, say, France, the UK, the US, and the USSR. So China engaged in military clashes in 26.3% of the MIDs. China assumed a higher level of escalation than even the US. Now, in terms of the dispute violence level, France and China are similar. China acted on disputes for territorial reasons. The US typically did it for policy to do with positional politics. In other words, in its competition with major powers like the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And the USSR and India typically engaged in disputes because of regime reasons. In other words, the government was pushed along a policy that enhanced the legitimacy of the government. Now, Alistair Ian Johnson examines a series of hypotheses. The first are diversionary theories, the idea that China pursues conflict in order to divert the attention of its population from economic or social turmoil. Well, there is simply not a lot of data, according to Alistair Ian Johnson, that justifies this relationship. The evidence is that Chinese unrest is inversely related to the MIDs. In other words, the more domestic unrest there is in China, the less likely it is to engage in disputes with its neighbors. So this is sort of a preoccupation model, which challenges diversionary theories of disputes and war. China's focus is primarily on social order, and once that's secured, then it embarks on territorial disputes. Now, the exception is the 1969 Sino-Soviet border conflict, which is highly salient. So this raises an issue. In terms of frequency, diversionary war is not a major motivator, but in terms of intensity, it is. The second hypothesis is the foreign policy of revolutionary states. The conventional wisdom is that revolutionary states are very aggressive, having to sincerely follow through on their promises once the state is established. However, there were relatively few militarized interstate disputes during the Cultural Revolution within China, which contradicts this. Geopolitical issues have a much stronger association with Chinese motives to initiate a dispute. The third hypothesis is that the need for balancing against external threats motivates disputes. Again, there's no relationship between power differences between China and its neighbors and disputes. One of the implications of this is that China cannot be deterred, because even if it is the weaker party, on the basis of principle, it can initiate a conflict. Hypothesis 4, territorial consolidation. China's got a great many neighbors, a lot of unconsolidated territories, meaning territories it's claimed to have lost in the 19th century. And so we could propose a prospect theory, which is the theory of risk in the mind of individual decision makers. The idea of gambling, where leaders, if they thought they possessed something in the past, they think of it as a loss. And like a gambler, they will act far more aggressively for something that they thought they had lost in the past than something new they're going to get. So this proposes that China will be particularly aggressive to reclaim what it imagines is lost territories. Now, there's some moderate relationship for this, and there's a similar behavior profile between China, India, and the Soviet Union with regard to disputes over territories that were once seen as being governed by their capitals. The fifth hypothesis is that status gaps and China's foreign policy explains the incidence of dispute initiation. So in effect, power status is the domestic perception of the international perception of the prestige of China's government. The evidence is that China's dispute violence will not increase with the closing of status, but primarily the difference. In other words, China's more aggressive the weaker it believes it is, and the closer it approximates its neighbors, the less likely it is to dispute a crisis. So the general conclusion is that there will not be a power transition. In other words, you're not going to have a conflict where China becomes more and more powerful, and when it surpasses the local power of the US and its allies in the region of Asia, then it's likely to begin disputes and to trigger a conflict. China will fight if its territory and status is threatened. So it's not as aggressive as Scobell's formulation of Chinese foreign policy. Yuan Kang Wang, in his book Harmony and War, Confucian Culture and Chinese Power Politics, 2011, disagrees with Johnson. He starts from the perspective of structural realism, which is also called realism. This is a microeconomic theory that argues that states are defensively positionalist. In other words, state leaders focus on the ranking of a country relative to other countries. They focus on this ranking as an indicator of how the state will survive because the anarchy of the international system, meaning there's no overarching authority, compels states through the fear of extinction to maximize their survivability by pursuing self-help measures in the form of foreign policy. So here you've got structure which shapes and shoves states into behaving a certain way and puts parameters on the possible choices of these states. So this is the assumption that Wang brings in to analyze Chinese behavior. So these are the hypotheses that Wang argues. China's power, it's the independent variable, determines China's policy. So China is either weak and then has defensive foreign policy, or it's strong and it has an offensive foreign policy. For Wang, there's no ideational constraints. China's essentially a realpolitik player. In other words, it might hide its foreign policy behind Confucian ideals, but it essentially respects power like any highly adaptable state. Now, there's an alternative explanation, which argues that, Wang is wrong. Han Wu-Ti's frontiers delimit the point beyond which expansion becomes prohibitively expensive for China. So China will not act aggressively beyond a certain geographic distance because historically it knows it's too expensive to reach too far beyond that particular arbitrary geographical limit. So Wang proposes a muscular Confucianism. The Qing dynastic tradition was adopted from China's Song dynasty, which opposed the eventual emergence of the Mongol occupation of China. Wang argues that Chinese pacifism as a foreign policy is a myth, and China's not seeking to restore the status quo ante. In other words, the world that China experienced during the Qing dynasty before the imposition of European foreign policy in around 1800. And China does not attack as a policy of last resort. China will adjust its war aims upward if given the opportunity. So if it sees it has enough power to take something, it will then change its foreign policy and take that thing. When China is on the defensive, it focuses on internal development. And this is similar to realist theories termed defensive realism, where it'll focus on its ranking and it'll try to cultivate the resources necessary to improve its ranking without having to attack its neighbors. The Great Wall of China was developed after the Ming Dynasty fell into decline in the post-1449 period. The explanation is that China is not culturally hardwired for aggression. I mean, it has unit-level pacifism in the form of domestic Confucian ideology. But this has been consistently overridden in practice by elite decision makers by structural threats outside of China. So that China is Confucian when it can be, but very often it faces such dire threats to its security, it has to cancel Confucian culture and reassert realpolitik foreign policy. Now, the alternative hypothesis is that cultural explanations provide for improvements on structural explanations. And so this is a focus on ideas away from a focus on the realist examination of power. All right, and this is an attempt to explain additional variants, additional changes in Chinese foreign policy above a simple, relatively oversimplified focus on power. Number one, there's a lag between structure and policy choice. Cultural explanations provide a faster solution to understand why countries do things. Two, irrational behavior. China's self-image impeded its ability to make alliances in the past. And this was not calculated. It was simply irrational behavior, and cultural explains this irrational behavior better than any realist power-based theory. Number three, indeterminate situations. Confucianism explains why China expanded the tribute system, but it does not explain why China did not pursue the creation of building colonies like the European states. So Confucianism has some explanation as a cultural variable, but it doesn't explain everything. Number four, justification. Inactivity during weakness was justified by classical thought. So when China was weak, it would revert to domestic pacifism and then buy time for preparation. So for Wang, ideology is less important than balance of power in, for example, the Sino-Soviet relationship or the Chinese-American relationship. China's military seizes the initiative. It engages in attack preemption. It's risk acceptant with regard to escalation. It seeks military surprise and psychological shock on the opponent. It engages in preventative war to attack the opponent before the opponent gets too strong. And it acts during opening windows of vulnerability and closing windows of opportunity, as realism would predict. China also alters its war aims as it perceives its relative power increasing. So you don't ask, what does China want? You ask, how much power does China have? And then you examine what China can achieve with that power. This is according to Wang. So we can wonder, well, China's current peaceful development, is it a responsible great power with a status quo orientation, joining international organizations? Is it sacrificing relative gains considerations in order to abide by a conventional international standard of behavior? Is China reversing its weakness since the Opium War? These are important questions about what China's foreign policy is going to do in the future. Now, China appears, according to Wang, to seek to close the relative power gap between itself and the U.S., while the U.S. is seeking to suppress the rise of any new threat to global hegemony in the Eurasian landmass. Uncertainty is driving the security dilemma between China and the U.S. When we mean by the security dilemma, we don't mean insecurity. Certainly there's insecurity between the U.S. and China. What the security dilemma argues is that the U.S. and China, because they're focusing on each other as the threat, and are artificially inflating each other as a threat, are focusing on each other as a threat, are investing more power into addressing each other's threat, and are therefore reducing their relative and their collective security between each other disproportionately. So it's not just insecurity, it's significantly worsened insecurity because they're locked in an action-reaction process. China fears a focus on military development will result in its collapse like that of the Soviet Union. So if China spends too much on military defense, it will weaken itself economically and then fall behind. Economic growth is a priority for China's legitimacy for its 1.4 billion people. And this enhances the ability of the Communist Party to persist as the main governing organization in China. Closing the wealth gap with the U.S. has long been a goal of China, not only the per capita income, but the gross economy, although China has not yet surpassed the U.S. in nominal GDP. China's defense budget has been significantly increasing over the past couple of decades, and in 2023 it's about $250 billion versus the $800 billion that the U.S. spends. But it should be qualified that the U.S. has a significant part of its defense budget focused on transportation, because the U.S. is isolated on its own continent, and a large part of the U.S. costs have to do with the high cost of labor in the U.S. market. The U.S. and China each spend about 3 to 5% of their GDPs on defense, which is far less than the 20% that ultimately crippled the USSR. China's military buildup focuses on Taiwan, then the South China Sea, and it's working on global maritime access to protect its energy and its commerce. Beijing seeks to focus on information warfare. In 2007, it conducted a successful anti-satellite test. And China wants to leapfrog past industrial mechanization right into information age, including supercomputers and various forms of artificial intelligence. China is very interested as a consequence in asymmetric warfare. Now, Beijing originally avoided multilateral institutions because it much preferred bilateral control over its neighbors because of its significant size. If it engaged in a multilateral organization, there would be collective organizations against it. And China feared that unrestrained U.S. power would organize these other countries. But China also recognized that the U.S. was equally restrained by being a member of these multilateral organizations. 85% of Chinese arm imports and technology transfer came from Russia since the 1990s. NATO and the U.S. in the Balkans led to strategic cooperation in 1996, which was strengthened in 2001 by the U.S. decision to cancel the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And the 2001 Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation that was signed between Beijing and Russia to counterbalance the U.S.-European cooperation. China established intelligence posts, 2 of them in Cuba. And China has challenged European influence in Africa and American trade and commerce in South America. Alistair Ian Johnson, in his book Cultural Realism, which is a very important book, attacked and tried to falsify a notion of strategic culture. So he raised 3 questions about Chinese strategic culture. 1, what role does conflict or warfare play in human affairs? 2, what is the nature of the enemy and the threat that it poses? And 3, how efficacious is the use of force in dealing with threats to state security? So Johnson begins by looking at the texts of the 7 military classics of the Ming Dynasty. This period focused on the Confucian-Mencian paradigm in the literature. This argued that conflict is aberrant and avoidable with good government, and you can co-opt external threats, and when force is used, it must be done minimally, defensively, and under favorable circumstances, and justified as a righteous war. Now this contrasts with what we call the parabellum paradigm from the Roman general and writer Vegetius, who wrote Si vis pacem parabellum. In other words, if you want peace, you got to prepare for war. In other words, deterrence, the important value of having security. This implies that China is actually a realpolitik state with its decision makers in foreign policy. So China's got a dual system. It has a realpolitik foreign policy, but it justifies it using Confucian ideology. What Johnson is looking at specifically is how China managed, through diplomacy, the threat of the northern nomads during the Ming Dynasty. Now, Mao rejected the idea of not using force to win. So in contemporary China, because of the communist experience, the reaction to the use of violence is far less restrained than it was during the Ming Dynasty. But Johnson argues that you've had a consistent understanding by the diplomatic elite in China of the importance of power. And what varies in different historical periods is the extent to which Confucian ideology was used to justify China's foreign policy. Larry Wurtzel, in his 2002 article, China's Foreign Policy Conflict Since 1949 in a Military History of China, argues that China fights to reinforce territorial claims and to defend buffer zones. China, for example, engaged in incursions in Burma in 1960 and 1961. It built roads in Laos. It mobilized on the Indian border in 1965 to support Pakistan. In 1978, it engaged in a standoff with Japan over the Senkaku Islands. It seized some of the select islands in the Spratly Chain in 1988. It fired missiles off Taiwan in 1995 and 1996. It seized the Mischief Reef from the Philippines in 1995. And on April 1st, 2001, a Chinese aircraft collided with a U.S. EP-3 reconnaissance aircraft off the Chinese coast. So in the Rand Corporation analysis, it was found that the conditions for when China fights are 1, to protect its core area, 2, to control its periphery, 3, to gain relative power, 4, to coerce weak states, and 5, as a domestic diversion from issues occurring within China. China's goals are typically to achieve political shock preemptively against their target. The overarching goal is to reassert status that was lost during the Century of Humiliation, typically dated from 1842, which is the Opium War, to 1949, which is the reestablishment of the Chinese Communist Party. Another explanation is from Garver and his typology of when China uses force. He argues that it occurs when China's trying to deter superpowers, 2, to defend territory, 3, to regain lost territory, 4, to enhance regional influence, and 5, to enhance global status. Now, it's argued that China has a neo-maritime interest, and this occurred and emerged under vice chairman of the CMC, the Chinese Military Committee, and with a friendly Navy chief during Deng Xiaoping's era. He was the leader that replaced Mao and preceded Hu Jintao. This led to an attack on the Vietnamese Paracel Islands in 1974. Here you can see the South Vietnamese admiral that fought and lost control of those islands. China used fishing vessels as a cover to approach the islands and then attacked. There was a missile strike on a South Vietnamese destroyer and then an amphibious operation that landed 600 Chinese Marines on the Vietnamese islands. Now, China has been traditionally friendly with Thailand and Cambodia, and so it attacked Vietnam in 1979. The lessons learned were that China needed to reform its military, including rank structure. In other words, formal Western types of military structure, and to reject its classless uniform system that made its military inefficient in its invasion of Vietnam. You can see the Spratly Islands depicted in the center picture, as well as the Taiwanese island, Itu Aba, with its rebuilt airfield in 2007, which is on the bottom right. In 1975, South Vietnam occupied 4 of the islands in the region, which were then adopted by North Vietnam when Vietnam was unified. 1988, China had a clash with Vietnam and sank 3 Vietnamese supply ships. 1995, China took the Mischief Reef despite claims from the Philippines. showing that China will use power to reclaim territories that had been lost.